I am so delighted, Michelle, to welcome you to the Stamford Symphony for this upcoming performance on May 7th and 8th of this really wonderful piano concerto by Florence Price. Um, Aside from the fact that you now have lived with this piece quite a bit and played it in a lot of places, I'm just so excited to have the chance to make music with you and to collaborate for the first time. It's really wonderful. So welcome and thank you for doing this.
Thank you. It's a delight for me as well. It is true that I have had many opportunities in the past year to share Florence Price's concerto, which has been my dream since I discovered it in 2016. But it is my first time working with you and visiting Stamford. So that is a delight and honor, and I look forward.
And let's talk about that a little bit because even you only discovered the piece in 2016. The piece was written a long time ago. So before we even talk about the work itself, we should talk about Florence Price because she's a fascinating figure in American music. Unjustly neglected, the first woman of color. I mean, in those days, just the idea that the Chicago Symphony would play a piece by a woman was already pretty radical. And then on top of that, her life circumstances were not very easy. She was, of course, an African American woman, and yet Frederick Stock and the Chicago Symphony embraced her first symphony and put her on the map. Talk a little bit about that and how you see her evolution in American music.
Absolutely. It is amazing. I think that just hearing her story and giving a little bit of background, which I would like to give, it highlights the kind of strength of character that was within her and the drive that she had from a young age to succeed, to write and to be known, even with these obstacles that were constantly put in front of her. I think one big part of that is her upbringing. She was born in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1887. And this was a important time in history in that there were many, I mean, often, at least for me as a child, as I sort of took in American history, and I would focus on the more recent side, which was, the Jim Crow laws and segregation and how the South was not the place to be, even in slavery, times you didn't, the South was a scary place and opportunities were not available. When I look back on my history, a sort of simplistic way of looking at it, right? But what sometimes I think we tend to forget is that there was this very important period when, after slavery had been abolished, in which in the South there were many Black families that were doing very well, that were doing financially well, that were able to get a full education. There were Black families that wanted to live in the South. Things were really thriving. And this was the case in 1887 for Florence Price.
Right.
And as a child, her mother was, a trained pianist and organist, and she started her on piano and organ, and her father was a dentist. And that is very significant because at this time, there were maybe a handful of dentists that were African American that you could even speak of in the entire country. And again, reasons being that it was not easy to get that kind of a degree, to get the education needed to be a dentist. So they were part of the upper class in Little Rock at the time. What great parents she had. They believed in really supporting the Black community as well. The father often gave a lot of free labor and dental work to those that needed it. Just inspiring parents. And so at any rate, she was given, this was her environment, and she was able to study soon from, one of the better teachers in Little Rock for piano and organ. She was this prodigy. She was writing music from a young age. She eventually went to the New England Conservatory at the age of 16.
Right.
And 3 years, it took her 3 years. She left with 2 degrees in piano and organ, of course, had studied composition as well. And what's interesting is then, as we go through her life and history, she makes her way back down south first in Atlanta, at Clark Atlanta University, as a professor of music, and then back to Little Rock. And at this point, we're heading into the 1920s, we're getting into that period, and things are rapidly changing. That kind of comfort that she experienced as a young child, which I think is actually a very important time to experience that feeling of confidence and limitless potential, that was drastically different. She tried to join the Music Teachers Association, the local chapter, and she was denied because they didn't accept anyone of color. Right. And so this was not the Little Rock she grew up in. So of course, she had to make the decision, as many Black artists and musicians did at this time, to leave the South and head up north. And one very important city was Chicago. Many, it was interesting as I read how many great Black musicians, poets, artists, you name it, made their way at some point to Chicago. And I think as well, this is something inspiring, because when you have so many great minds in the same city, collaborating, supporting each other, there's even more, there's only good things can come from that. So as much as it was sad for her to leave her hometown, this was the best move she could make.
Well, of course, and we have to say also, and I'm sure you know the book, it's so phenomenal, Isabel Wilkerson's amazing The Warmth of Other Suns, but the idea of the Black population in the South aspiring to make this move and aspiring to a different life for various reasons, and going to these metropolitan centers, Detroit, Chicago, that was not just an economic shift for this country. It was a huge intellectual and artistic shift. It was fundamental. And remember also that there was a lot of energy and creativity around with Black musicians right at the turn of the century. We get into the 20s, it's after World War I, and then certainly in the 30s, when the Depression hits, the world changes. And things get much more restrictive. I think it's a fascinating, and then you have the New Deal, and the New Deal was supposed to reinvigorate the arts in this country. There was a lot of racism there against the Black community there.
Absolutely. No, and that's a very interesting point that, you cannot ignore as we, tell the story, what was happening in the world. And like you said, what this kind of a migration that they called it, this was a great migration, right, of artists and such to these cities, how that affected the arts. What was, I think, very wonderful for her was the opportunity that presented itself when she, very soon after actually arriving to Chicago, which was this competition, the Wanamaker Music Competition. Right. It was actually made for the, specific purpose of highlighting Black composers. Right. And she entered in 2 categories with her Symphony No. 1 and also with her piano sonata. And she won top prize in both categories. And that win, of course, put her on the history books quite literally as the first Black woman to have major symphonic work performed by a major orchestra. And that was, of course, with Chicago Symphony with Frederick Stock, as you mentioned. And that was the Symphony No. 1. Now, what definitely hits me, and this was very recent, as we connect to the fact, as you mentioned, the piano concerto, I discovered it in 2016, but it was written around 1934. Right. The premiere of her Symphony No. 1 with Chicago Symphony was 1932. So putting all of that together, one thing that definitely sticks out to me is that she writes the symphony, one thing that definitely sticks out to me is that the symphony was premiered in 1932. And her piano concerto, which was written around 1934, and I don't discover it until 2016. And so we look at that and think, wow, what a huge gap. Another thing that really sticks out to me is that, the Philadelphia Orchestra just received a Grammy for her Symphony No. 1 and 3, and it's 2022. And again, it was premiered and it made history for the first time in 1932. So that's 90 years ago. So at any rate, I mean, we stop and think about exactly how much time has passed and, where's the disconnect? And so I think that what's most important is what you said earlier, which is that it's amazing that the Chicago Symphony even played her music because she was a woman, right? Because if I'm not mistaken, the orchestra at this time, there were no women in the orchestra in the early 1930s.
In Chicago and almost everywhere else as well, unless they maybe a harpist, but
Right. I don't even think so. I think it was even a male harpist. I thought I remembered looking at a picture
yeah,
of the orchestra then. And so she actually puts it well. And she says, please forgive the handicap of my race and gender. This is that message that's sent to Kusevitsky in Boston Symphony, around sometime in the 30s, that letter that she sends, because she knew that just being a woman was going to be, it was holding her back just because of that. But to be a Black woman, I mean, what are you doing? This is not your place. And but not for lack of trying. I think what amazes me the most is how much music she wrote. I mean, her catalog is so
it's big. Yeah, yeah.
she,
Well, she was very prolific, and the other thing which strikes me is that there has to be some awareness that she was writing music that was absolutely of its time, but not in any way that would have people would have dismissed because it was too experimental or it was too out there or something. There was no good reason for them not to play her music. I mean, let's talk about specifically the piano concerto. Which has that absolutely beautiful slow. Well, first of all, we should say it's one movement. It's one thing. But the de facto slow movement is gorgeous. The interplay, the way the whole piece is so well crafted, and the way the orchestra and the piano interact. The Juba dance at the end is wonderfully wrought. There's so much in there. It's not like, oh, okay, people were going to shy away from her because the music was too experimental or anything like that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
What do you hear in her music in terms of influence?
Well, that and actually, I'm excited that I'll be presenting the piano concerto, because I feel that the piano concerto is actually a really, really good introduction to her music, if it happens to be your introduction, because in those three sections that do feel like three movements, of course, you get a sense of the, I think, primary elements of her style and her inspiration. So in that first section of the concerto, you're going to hear, literally from even the first page, this reference to the Romantic era. Even the way that the cadenza starts out, this is like Brahms' piano concerto, and certain Romantic composers would do something. Usually if you think about a lot of, and Beethoven also pushed the boundaries a little bit, but Mozart, you'd have these long tutis, and then the soloist would come in, and there was and you definitely wasn't starting out with a cadenza at the very least, even if you started the concerto as a soloist. So you had the Romantic composers, even Beethoven a little bit, starting to push those boundaries. And so you see that structure where in the beginning of the concerto, there's a small, very small introduction from the orchestra. And then the piano does its big cadenza, and it's right at the beginning of the piece, right? And of course, the harmonies and the huge arpeggios and everything else, which again, fit so many, of these great, Rachmaninoff big octaves or Brahms or whatever. And you're just going to sense a lot of references to her love for Romantic music. That being said, in the midst of this, you'll hear folk songs. You will hear these you'll hear the pentatonic scale, which is of course big part of folk music. And you'll hear idioms and melodies that are connected to, Black America. And I think what's amazing is she does this a lot in her first symphony and her piano sonata, where that opening movement is this like wonderful mixture of these styles that are connected to her, love and inspiration. Then in the second section, it is a song. It's a spiritual.
Right.
In every way, it's reminiscent of a spiritual and the structure of spirituals. It is unique, though. The melody is original and unique, something that we know Dvorak did and others, where you would be Dvorak with Hungarian folk songs, but not always to mimic an exact folk song, but in that structure. So she does that same thing. And it's just, as you said, it's just gorgeous, this gorgeous duet, which is essentially the call and response, which is also a typical structure, not only in spirituals, but now in modern gospel music. That's the kind of structure you get from the second section of the piano concerto with the oboe and the piano, with this sort of duet. And then as you mentioned, the Juba dance, which she uses this in her symphony number 1. It's in a lot of her chamber music for piano or just strings. In the piano sonata, she has references to that dance in the third movement. So anyway, she loves the Juba dance. This is an African dance that was popularized in the South during slavery and beyond. And it was a dance she definitely knew and heard from a young age, and she'd always wanted to incorporate it into her music. I read that one of her biggest inspirations was Nathaniel Dett in his In the Bottom Suite, and he has a Juba dance in there for the piano. And I read how she heard this piece and heard how he did it. Nathaniel Dett was a composer she looked up to, and started to then use it in a lot of her music. So this is the concerto, but as I've mentioned, it just all these parallels that you find in a lot of her big, her huge works. And it's just, to me, it highlights her training at New England. She understood, the structure and, learned from the great composers before her. But any great composer, really great composer that deserves a place, in the books, finds a way to then make it their own, right? You're learning from those before you, but you're making it unique to you. And for her, that was connecting to her roots, connecting to music of the church and religious music and dance music and all of these things that were loved and understood and, connections in Black America at that time. But her sound world, in the midst of all that, it's just so soulful. It's her voice that just shines through. And you feel, as you play it, as you experience it, you just feel this connection right to the deepest part of your soul. I think it's just amazing.
Well, she's very authentic. But what inspires me is that she is, only since you mentioned Dvorak, she's the embodiment of what he was trying to say to Americans. Remember that he came in 1892, I think, to head this school in New York, the conservatory that was set up by a woman, Jeanette
Yes.
Thurber, and they admitted students who were women and of color, which was radical. And they both agreed that they should pay no tuition. So that whole experiment was already so forward-looking, and Dvorak, realizing that America still had this incredible inferiority complex and was constantly looking to Europe and imitating old traditions, said, "You're crazy. Look what you have here in your resources and think about indigenous music, folk music, your own traditions." She did it. She actually did it. So I think it's an incredibly important milestone in American music, but more than that, it's a wonderfully inspiring story. And I think, okay, 90 years is a little too long to have waited, but better late than never, right?
Well said.
Well, I am absolutely thrilled that we're going to do this piece together. I cannot wait to share this music with our audience and to be on the stage with you. It's going to be fantastic. Thank you, Michelle. I'm really, really grateful that we were able to work this out.
Thank you. I look forward.
Me too.